Welcome to the Charm School Crafts Polymer Clay tutorial on Pandora-style beads. The first thing we'll need to look at is the equipment, and it's very basic. All you need is a cocktail stick, a straw, one pair of bead centres per bead, your polymer clay of course, and it's useful to have a means of measuring out the clay. In this instance I've got a work mat with a template. So the amount of clay that we're using is approximately the equivalent of a quarter block of Sculpey, and I've got two colours. I've got a turquoise and white, and I've made a mid colour to just make it a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to now combine them into a twist pattern to make the marbling effect that you can see on some of the pink beads at the beginning of the film. So this amount of clay will make roughly 3 or 4 of the Pandora beads, and so I'd like them all to kind of go together, but they'll all be individual as well. They're going to end up being a marbled sort of effect, but the colours need to be combined a little more. So I'm just going to play with the twisting and combining until I get the effect that I want. At the moment it's a little bit too separate colours, and I wanted a bit more fine than that. So this process goes on a little bit, it's just rolling, doing a sort of rougher roll than you would for canes, because it doesn't matter if it's a little bit lumpy. So I'm ultimately aiming to make a short stumpy cane, just to make the 3 or 4 beads, and the diameter that I want it to be all along its length is 13 millimeters. So I have to make sure that I create the pattern that I want when it's shorter, so when it's condensed. So I'm working towards that. We want to achieve a uniform diameter so that when we finally cut the beads and make the beads up, they'll be of a uniform shape and size, which is where the template on the work mat that I'm using comes in. We can use that to make sure that the little short fat cane that we've ended up with is of a uniform diameter along it, as you can see. So then what we do is we've checked the diameter, and now we turn it round and place it along the parallel lines of the work mat. I'm actually selecting a little section that I'd like to make a bead out of, and using a tissue blade or craft knife, you then cut the equivalent of 13 millimeters section out of the cane, and of course the template will give you that guide. So I'm using a craft knife here. It's probably easier if you use a tissue blade, to be perfectly honest, but either will do. So if you haven't got a tissue blade, not to worry. So I'll just get rid of the excess, and you can see that the section that I've cut is 13 millimeters. So now we need to start forming the bead. We could roll it into a ball in our hands, but you might lose some of the patterns, so it depends on how you want to do it. It's fine. I'm actually going to preserve the marbling around the outside of the bead that I had planned, and I'm just squidging it slightly into a sort of almost a fat disc really, and just checking and squishing it on the work mat to flatten it a little. So now we want to use the cocktail stick and the guidelines in the middle of the work mat to just place a pilot hole to guide us where to position the bead centre. This is a wee bit fiddly, but what you want to do is to position the first half of the bead centre in the middle of the top of the bead. So that's what the pilot hole will help to guide you to do. Don't press it at this stage, but use the straw in the centre of it to just pierce through the bead, and at the same time it helps to feed the bead core down into the polymer clay. So you're actually reducing the amount of distortion by using the straw to cut out the centre. So now we need to just press home the bead centre with our thumbnail, just take it round, pressing gently and also reshaping the flattened area of the polymer clay at the same time. So now it's ready for us to put the second half on. So if you push through the straw, it's taken out the core of the bead, and also it enables us to slip the second bead centre, the other half, onto the end of the straw. Now this is really helpful because we then simply slide it along the straw and insert it into the polymer clay. And as you'll see, it means that because we're doing it along the straw, the two centres align. If you just try to do it by eye or by guesswork, or even on a knitting needle, which I have seen as well, they're tapered, and so sometimes they don't really match up. So then we can just take it, use the straw as a spindle, and just roll the polymer clay and flatten the edges, and there we have the basic bead. So now all we need to do is to check and make sure that there's no really misshapen areas, that we're happy with the shape, the overall shape and size, and try to handle it as gently as possible so that you're not imprinting any fingerprints onto it. The last thing that we do before we bake it is to just clean the core with a cotton bud. So we just insert that gently and twist it round to get any of the excess clay that might have squeezed out. So just a final check all over to make sure there's no extra little fingerprints or bits of dust or anything that's untoward that we don't want there later, although we can sand them off later on. And now we're going to cure it, and always follow the manufacturer's instructions. There are guidelines on the back of the worksheet, but you'll find that all of the polymer clays come with their own instructions, and you must take notice of those, particularly regarding temperature. So you put your piece of polymer clay onto a baking tray on baking paper is advisable. You can use a domestic oven, and the important thing is also to test beforehand, so use a little bit of scrap if you haven't used the oven for this before. I'm baking these for 20 minutes. It's recommended usually about 15 minutes for every 6mm. So we let the pieces cool down, and then we can start actually tidying them up. If we need to, we might not need to. We use, the best thing is sponge sanding pads, which come in various degrees of coarseness. So use the coarser one first, and just smooth all the way around your bead on all surfaces, and just try to get off any remaining roughness or fingerprints or anything like that. Best really, if you can, to try and smooth the polymer clay before it's cured as much as possible to reduce the amount of rubbing down you'll need to do. It does create a dust, particularly if you're doing a lot of rubbing down, and it's not desirable to breathe it in, so try and keep it to a minimum. Be careful when you're cleaning around the centre of the beads, the silver part. They are plated, so you could actually rub off the silver plate if you're not too careful with the abrasive sanding pad. Just put your thumbnail over the silver to protect it while you're working, and that'll help. And then the last thing we do, with a cloth with a sort of roughish weave, such as denim, we buff the bead to a soft sheen. If you want it really shiny, you can always paint it with clear varnish, water-based varnish.